Thanks everyone for joining us today. Throughout the discussion today, feel free to drop questions in the chat or in the Q&A. We'll leave some time at the end to answer any questions that come in. So to get started, Barbara already gave the high level, but just to reintroduce myself, my name is Emily. I'm a data engineering manager at Gloss Genius, and I teach the analytics engineering with DBT course here on CoRise, and I am based in Boston, Massachusetts. Lindsay, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, yeah. Thanks, Emily. I'm Lindsay. So I am a new instructor joining CoRise. So I'll be teaching advanced DBT in July. And I'm currently the head of data at Acyclic. And I've been in the analytics industry for about 12 years. And just in the last couple of years, I've started working with DBT. So super excited to talk about this today.
Yeah, super excited we get to do this. So in terms of what we're going to talk about, first, we'll just touch on why DBT, some core principles, and then Lindsay will go into some of the challenges of scale and tips for scaling DBT successfully. And then, like I said, we'll leave probably the last 15 minutes for any questions. So again, feel free to throw those in throughout. So starting with why DBT, this is a chart that I think came out maybe this year sometime, or maybe the end of last year, but basically showing the rise of companies using DBT is just continuing to go up and up. So definitely adoption doesn't seem to be slowing down. There's a lot of tools even still coming out with ways to work with DBT more natively. And then along with that, the analytics engineering role is also just continuing to grow and become just a more mature career path as people are discovering the role, and there's more tools and courses and stuff like that to help train people for this sort of area. I searched on LinkedIn the other day and there was over 84,000 results when I just searched analytics engineer in the job section. So it's definitely out there and continuing to become a more popular career path for those interested in data. And sort of those adjacent skills learned with DBT are also just really valuable no matter where you go. So things like learning the command line, version control, Git or GitLab, GitHub, learning how to think about QA and testing, data modeling, learning how to document things in a way that is helpful for people to find what they're looking for. All of that is not gonna become less important. And then wanted to touch quickly on how we got here. The sort of older paradigm of ETL, a lot of companies, no matter really where you are, probably you have production data stored in a Postgres or a MySQL, but there's also all these other sources that your company cares about of data, things like Facebook, Salesforce, HubSpot, iTunes or Apple App Store, Google, all of that stuff. Event data is super important to get into one centralized place. But in this old paradigm, the transform step happened before data got into the data warehouse. And this definitely causes some issues. I personally have dealt with this at a company previously who lived in this world. One, if you want to backfill data, change some transformation logic, there's definitely a more complex process to get that done. Usually it doesn't land on the data team. It's usually some other engineering org that you need to put a ticket in with if you want to change a column name or change some logic. There's also less visibility into what's actually happening in that extract to transform to load step before it gets in the warehouse. So like people who are responsible for those data pipelines are then also responsible for how that data should be interpreted. And analysts, who are the ones using that data and closer to those business stakeholders who want to consume that data, have less control over the data they're using, how it's being transformed. So it was definitely harder to understand like the source of truth of how that data was getting to the data warehouse and what a field actually means. And then coming into this sort of new paradigm of ELT, this is where DBT comes in. The T could really be anything, but in our case, we're using DBT to do the transformation stage. So in this world, all the source data that we just talked about gets loaded into the warehouse as is from the source, and that transformation logic lands usually on analytics engineers or analysts on the data team. Of course, there's still issues with this. You need to still have process and best practices, align on definitions, make sure that things don't, again, get out of control and people still know what fields mean and how to use them. So this is what Lindsay's going to talk a bit about later on, and some tips on best practices for scaling our DBT projects, so we don't run into some of these issues. Probably most people here know what DBT is if you're on this call, but just to reiterate, or maybe if you're not as familiar, DBT is really just this framework for writing and compiling these SQL queries. There's tools around developing, testing, documentation, and deploying these data models into your data warehouse. And I really like DBT Lab's mission, so I wanted to put it out here, is that their mission is to empower data practitioners to create and disseminate organizational knowledge. So that's really the whole mission and purpose of the tools that DBT is building and that we're talking about today. And the DBT Viewpoint is pretty important to that mission. So not going to go into detail on all of these areas, but just to quickly touch on the main points. The first is there's this sort of like new modern analytics team. There's roles that need to understand how to ingest data. There's all these really powerful analytics databases a lot of us are using nowadays, and sort of our main tools to work with data are SQL and Python. And then we also have these really great visualization tools to help us have our stakeholders and others being able to visualize and use the data that we are like curating for them. And then the last couple are, one, like analytics is collaborative. We need ways where we can like work together effectively. Analytics code is an asset, so we really need to treat it as such. And lastly, analytics workflows require automation. So there's a lot of processes that DBT helps us automate. And really, one of the really important areas of DBT is the DAG. So maybe when you're starting out, your DAG is very simple, it's easy to follow. You can really understand what logic is flowing into what, and things are defined in one place. If things get out of control and we're not following the right processes and practices, things can get a little out of hand, and we start running into those issues of that we were trying to fix in the first place, of being able to understand what logic is happening where, making sure it's only defined in one place, that everyone's referencing the same thing so people come to the same answers. And we really need to be like diligent about making sure this doesn't end up happening with our DBT project as it grows. So I'll hand it over to Lindsay, and she's going to chat a bit about how to make sure our project stays as nice as when we first start out.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. Yeah, so as Emily mentioned, when you start out with a DBT project, things can be pretty straightforward. So you probably only have a few models, maybe a few people contributing to the project. But as you, over time, and as you start adding new models and new data sources, it can start to get pretty intense pretty quickly. So the picture that Emily showed on the previous slide just shows how things can get relatively complex. And this was something that I experienced firsthand at the last company that I worked for. We started with about, I think, 200 DBT models. And over the time that I was there, we scaled to about 400, 450. And I started to notice some patterns happening. So we can go to the next slide, Emily. And I think this is happening across DBT right now. And so a lot of teams who have been using DBT for a long time are hitting this scaling point. So while most teams starting out may have less than 100 models, there's actually some projects that DBT is now seeing that have, in some cases, over 5,000 models, which is a really big project. So this chart is something that DBT released earlier last year. And they're actually seeing that about 5% of the DBT install base has over 5,000 models, which the problems that you face when your model is 100 models, sorry, when your project is 100 models versus 5,000 are very different. And to go from that point of 100 models to over 5,000, you have to go through a lot of pretty big challenges. And so I was starting to notice some of these things at my last company, and I was starting to pick up on patterns that were being talked about in the industry as well. So if we go to the next slide. So things that I had noticed and things that I have often heard about, and I think, Emily, you mentioned that you've dealt with these as well. As you start to add more projects and more tests and just more things to your execution of your project, the project build time will start to slow down. When you start out with a few models, it might take only a couple seconds or maybe a few minutes to run your project. When you start adding really complex models and more data sources, the project build time can really climb. So at my last company, I was seeing this. I think when I started, the project build time was around 14 minutes for just to do a DBT build. And then over the course of my time there, that started to climb to over an hour, over to up to an hour and a half sometimes. And so what happens is if somebody's working in development or if they need to build the entire set of models in their own development environment, that can really slow things down. And so that can lead to people not really testing things in the same way. It can just make the development process not really very fun for the people working on the code base. And that kind of snowballs into other problems. So that can go into your continuous integration checks if you're doing those. At my previous company, we weren't using Slim CI when I started, which is a process of cutting down your continuous integration to only the models that you need to run, the ones that you've changed. And we were just doing a full build every time that we needed to rerun something. And so you can imagine every time that someone wanted a code check done, or a code review, sorry, they would have to wait however long, an hour before the CI finished. And then it would tell them there was a mistake. They'd have to go back into the code and fix the error. So that really slows the process down. It takes a really long time to get from feature ideation or request to actually launching something in production. Another big issue is around data quality. As the models start to get more complex and you have more dependencies between things, it gets a lot harder to understand if there's a problem here and something's failing, where do I go to fix that? And so while it can be pretty easy when things are just a few models, if you start to have really complex dependencies, that can really slow things down. And it also, I think, leads to this kind of fear of touching somebody else's code if something is really complex and someone's built a really complex model, or a lot of developers have contributed to a really complex model. It can make it a little tricky to go in and actually change something. And then obviously this kind of all snowballs into increasing costs. So if you're using a cloud data warehouse, which if you're using DBT probably are, everything there will be, you're getting charged in most cases for not just storage, but also your compute time. So if your project is running longer, you're being charged more for that. And then just moving data around. So if you have tools that you're moving data from Fivetran or Stitch or another ELT tool, that the data that you're adding to your project, if you're adding more sources, become more expensive. And so across the board, things just start to get a little bit more pricey. And we know in the current environment, that's pretty challenging. And then lastly, I found this personally, and I think as you start to grow your data practice and have some success with DBT and a few other things. People just want more of your team. And while that's great, that can be a difficult thing to balance. It can be hard to onboard new team members if you have a really complex project and you have some of the challenges that I've mentioned. And then also while bringing those people on, you're trying to manage onboarding, maintenance of what you've built, and then actually still servicing new requests. So on to the next slide. So if we think about taking those challenges and categorizing them, they fall into three big buckets. And the first one is really around process, which is really just obviously like your way of how you do things on your team. And so this can be, in some cases, my team was doing things manually that we could automate. And so that would save time and make sure that things were checked in a certain way at a certain point in the process. And that would help speed things up. And so finding some process efficiencies and thinking about how do we do the pieces of our work step by step and get from point A to point B, and finding efficiencies in your processes. Another big one is around people. And so this is really getting around a lack of alignment, either within your team or your external stakeholders, and really getting people on the same page about coding conventions, about how we deal with incoming work, about how we prioritize things. And this can actually have a really big impact on your team's productivity and efficiency as well. And then lastly, this is probably the one that everybody thinks of first, but I like to put this one last because tools are really the things that once you've figured out process and people is how you move towards getting things done and making sure that you have the right tools for the job. It's good to, in my opinion, to take a step back and look at the other two first and then figure out like what tools might help us to solve that problem. And in some cases, in this example, and what we're talking about today would be using DBT in a bit of a different way, but then also maybe adding packages, looking at other third-party tools to add those to your tech stack to help you overcome certain challenges. So just to tease those out just a little bit more. So when we think about overcoming some of the scaling challenges that I mentioned previously, one of the big things that I think is important is laying this really strong foundation. When you start out and things are really simple, if you're not really following best practices, you're going down this road where eventually you're going to have to come back and fix things. And that's really not helpful in a lot of ways. You will have to find the time and find the resources to come back and fix things where maybe you might have been cutting corners or just not doing something in the most optimized way without realizing. So I think understanding the best practices around DBT and then using things to help you enforce that. There's certain packages, there's different metadata observability tools and things that you can implement to understand what's the health of my project and how do I keep that in a good state over time. And then I think it's also important to think about build for what you need now, but think about what am I going to need in the next year, the next 6 months, and make your modeling and your testing conventions decisions based on that. So one of the things that we learned at my last company, we had pretty extensive testing conventions. So we had pretty straightforward, I would say, rules around you add anytime there's a primary key, make sure that you've added a not null and a unique test. But then we had very similar conventions across different types of data at the staging, intermediate, and core level. And so that meant that we might be retesting the same thing without really transforming the model in any way. And so while that's a really comprehensive and robust way of testing your models, it ends up not really scaling very well because as you start to grow over time, you're going to be running the same test essentially 3 times. And so that can really drive up cost and slow your project down. So thinking about those things early on is actually really important so that you don't get down the road and realize you have to go back and change a bunch of things. Another one is leveraging automation. So thinking about, as I mentioned, if you take your processes or the steps that you take to get from A to B, look at where are the steps in here where the team is doing something that is a bit manual. So maybe that's writing your documentation or running a code linter. Try and figure out areas where things can be automated to make it easier for your development team. And then also just to make sure that everyone's doing things in a similar way can really speed things up quite a lot. Building a scalable data quality framework. So I mentioned a little bit about this in the first point, but thinking about not just reactive data quality, which is a lot of built-in tests for DBT will help you once something has failed, but there's a lot of testing capabilities out there to help you proactively manage data quality. Looking at when I make this change to my code, how does this impact the output of the model? And then that can really help developers to fix issues before they even push something into production and maybe before waiting for something to go wrong. So those types of things can help you get ahead of issues, which can really save a lot of time. And then testing assumptions as well. A lot of the DBT tests that are built in are really around testing the data quality a little bit more, but they're not as much about testing the logic of your model. And so thinking about ways that you can actually test, which is more around unit testing or mock testing, to understand, is the model that I've built doing what I expect it to do? And so looking at the output and comparing that against some expected results potentially. And then lastly, thinking about how you responsibly manage your project over time and scale. So a lot of this will come back obviously to cost containment, which is a big hot topic for a lot of data teams right now, for better or for worse, where we have a much deeper magnifying glass on us these days. But I actually think that pushes us into a place of making sure that we're building projects responsibly and then monitoring that performance proactively. So one of the things that I learned managing my last team was we always put it on the back burner to build out some of these performance metrics. And I actually think that should have been one of our first priorities, because you keep an eye on how are things doing, where we may be having some issues that we're not really fully understanding, but KPIs could help us to identify that quicker and really just fix some problems before they really get really big and harder to solve. So I called them kind of smoldering problems here, but they're things that are the project's running slowly, things aren't going super efficiently, and you just always push it off to a back burner until something really breaks, and then it's a much bigger problem to solve. Yeah, so I think those are the key points for scaling challenges. Yeah, so I think just to close things off before we go to the Q&A session, as Barbara said at the beginning, Emily's course is very popular and a great course to get started with analytics engineering. The next cohort is in September. And then my course is more targeted towards people who may have been using DBT for a little while. You're having some of the scaling problems that we talked about a little bit there. And this will be launching in just next month, so in a few short weeks. So from there, I think we can open it up to Q&A. Thank you.
Barbara, do you want to?
In the Q&A, Aya asked, why are there a lack of learning resources for DBT?
I feel like there are a lot of resources out there. There's a lot of free learning resources within like the DBT labs ecosystem. They have a couple courses on their site that are free. So I think I can't remember them off the top of my head, but there's like a DBT fundamentals. I think there's a data modeling one. There might be a couple others that I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's on their site somewhere.
Yeah, I found those when I was learning DBT. I think, Emily, for you, like you learned DBT before a lot of these resources were available. I learned it a bit more recently. And personally, I found for those resources that they're good to get you started, but they don't have a lot of examples. And so I think what is so great about Emily's course, and I think a lot of the ones that are a bit more involved, is that you actually get to try certain examples and work on a project. And I think that helps a lot with learning. The ones on DBT, they do have some good examples, but it doesn't really go super deep, and they're only about an hour. But I think if you're looking somewhere to get started, they're definitely a good resource.
Yeah. There's also like a lot of people have put out a lot of content here and there just on the problems they're dealing with and how they solved them, especially like different conference talks, blog posts. There's a lot of stuff out there. And the DBT Slack is definitely a good place to ask questions.
Yeah.
Difference between DBT and Dagster Airflow?
Yeah, so Dagster and Airflow are more like orchestration tools. So like you'd build basically like your DBT DAG in Dagster Airflow or DBT Cloud. And they're not specific to DBT, so you can build any number of data pipelines in those tools, versus DBT is just for your data transformation and testing specific to DBT models. I would say they're like different categories.
Can you suggest the best online learning for DBT training? I think you covered some of this in your previous question, but you can do a plug for your upcoming courses.
Take our classes.
Best practices to keep in mind that will make future scaling easier when you are initially designing your DBT projects/models.
You want
Yeah.
to take that?
Sure, yeah, I can jump in and then I'd love to hear your thoughts too, Emily. Yeah, I think it's that you want to be considering where you're going to be in the next 6 months to a year even. And I think just adopting best practices from the beginning. So making sure that you're using modeling layers, you're thinking about the way that you're materializing your models, you're not rebuilding dependencies that don't need to be there. I think one thing that we kind of learned was maybe our team wasn't looking at the DAG enough. Like they would not go back and figure out where should I put this model in my design, and they might just add something on that really could have been optimized in a different way. So I think those things are all really good practices to just make sure that you're not overcomplicating things and that you're keeping things as simple as possible.
Yeah, definitely starting as soon as possible with a standard and best practice. And like
Mhm.
Lindsay mentioned, keeping an eye on sort of that, like those performance metrics and like metadata from the start. So you can keep an eye on how things are growing.
Mhm.
As slim CI sounds really interesting. Is there an equivalent for production runs? For example, if the SQL for a given view hasn't changed between runs, could I skip the view being recreated?
I don't know how much that would like, I think views take like a second to make because they're not actually um running any, no data's being transformed in a view. It's just putting that metadata in the warehouse of if someone calls this view, run this SQL. So the complexity of that might not be worth it, but I see what you're getting at.
I have heard
I think
about
incremental models maybe is like something that gets at that, where it's you're only building the data for that day that has changed.
yeah, I know that there's folks out there who are using things to like reactive orchestration. So in a lot of ways, like proactive orchestration is this in the sense that you're updating your models based on a schedule. So you would say this model we update once a day, or maybe we update these models like a few times a day. There are cases where people are using things to detect in my source table, do I have new data here? And then trigger an orchestration run based on that. So that's a little bit similar. It's not quite the same as this CI run, but that would be potentially a way. Like Emily said, for a view, it wouldn't really matter, but maybe for a table or something that you don't really want to rerun and rebuild something unless there's actually new data, that might be a bit of a different approach.
To detect unused models.
Yes, we have a process for that. Maybe you do too, Lindsay, but depending on your warehouse, you probably have, like we use Snowflake. So there's a bunch of Snowflake like metadata tables that tell you like query history and stuff like that. So we've built some reporting off of those to tell us, has this model not been queried in X number of days? And then we can prioritize uh, cleaning things up that have not been used in however long that we decide on. So I think that's super important too, to keep your warehouse clean and make sure people aren't using stale
Mhm.
models that maybe shouldn't be used anymore.
Yeah, for sure. We used Redshift in my last company, so we didn't have as good of metadata built in. But yeah, definitely either if it's Snowflake or there's a lot of third-party tools that help with that as well. So things that kind of connect into your tech stack and help you not just with your DBT models, but also on like your BI side and popularity of certain models or dashboards. And that can really help to sort of surface things that we built this, but no one's really using it anymore. We should probably get rid of it.
To write efficient DBT code. I feel that in my team, only a couple of people care about DBT performance.
I think maybe like building that into your like code review process, making sure that's like an expectation of contributing to DBT, is you have to meet these standards and people are gonna consistently check those during code review, call them out, build that collaboration and I don't know the word I'm looking for, but keeping everybody like accountable, making sure that's stated as a priority.
Yeah, for sure. I agree. We used to do a code convention meeting. So we would talk about maybe once every quarter or something, we'd get together and say, does anyone have any things they want to raise about how they want to change certain ways that we do things? And sometimes we'd have these conversations more frequently, but I think that's helpful to get everybody's buy-in, and it gets the team as more cohesive as a team to say, this is the way we do things and here's why. And I think as a data team leader or manager, if that's in the role that you're in, it's also to help the team to understand why you do things a certain way. If you're writing inefficient DBT code and that's costing more money because models aren't materializing in a certain way or it's slowing the team down, I think it's really important to call that stuff out and have those really frank talks with the team, because sometimes it's just a matter of helping somebody understand why we need to do things a certain way. And that can really help to motivate them and get their buy-in.
Necessarily see themselves in a data science role, what level of knowledge of DBT do you think would be helpful? Any thoughts in helpful this knowledge would be within a company with a data science team?
Sorry, so the question is, how much does a data scientist need to know about DBT?
I think so.
I guess it depends on your company. At my old role, we had a data science team who contributed to DBT. And most of what they did was like building off of the foundation that the rest of the analytics team built. So like they would use our sort of foundational like dim and fact models to build out their like training data sets or like feature sets for inputs for their like data science models that they would use in like Databricks or some other system. So it was like they would use the data team's foundation of data models to feed into their data science workflows. So in that case, it's really knowing how to write SQL and still following like the data team's best practices around like how to contribute to DBT. But yeah, it really depends. Like data science roles are so different across different companies.
Yeah, that title is usually one of the most broad ones I find.
What about a non-data science? A non-data scientist at a data science company that uses DBT, how much should they know?
Yeah, I guess depends what their role is. Like, are they an analyst or?
Yeah, I don't know if I don't know from a data consumer perspective, like a business person or an analyst, maybe that works more in the business. I think anyone in an analyst role would benefit, but if SQL, then you can get by with most things in DBT. And if you know a little bit of Python, then you can probably figure out Jinja and a few other things. I think that was the biggest thing I learned when I learned DBT. I didn't really know what it was until I got under the hood a little bit. And it really is, it's mostly SQL and learning Jinja and just how things work together. And then, as Emily mentioned earlier, learning things like version control and Git and things like that, which are a little bit different for the workflow of a typical analyst or maybe a data scientist. But yeah, I think it just depends on what role you're in and how you're contributing to the data team.
Yeah, I find that people who are starting out learning DBT really don't struggle with DBT itself, but it's more like you said, the adjacent skills around how to contribute, Git, command line, some of those more like software engineering type skills are really where a lot of people get more hung up on than DBT specifically. That's what I've seen from the course and also like from the teams I've been on.
Yeah, for sure.
There's a question here. Charlie asked, we have a lot of challenges around setting up DBT, CI, CD, B/C. We have multi-environment variables and projects involved. Will these sorts of challenges be covered in the advanced DBT CoRise course?
So to an extent, so we'll go a little bit into CI/CD, but that is a little bit more in some other areas. So I think for us, we'll be focused more on specifically DBT, and we'll talk a little bit into those areas, but there might be some other courses that might be a little bit better for that. We will definitely be talking about multi-environment variables and things like that. So if you're interested in a little bit more there, the course website does have a pretty detailed bullets on some of the things we'll cover and what will be in the projects.
Awesome. Someone asked how to read more on data management regarding metadata, CDC. Do you have any books or resources that you would recommend?
I've really been liking Joe Reese and Matt Housley's book, The Fundamentals of Data Engineering. So that's like a much more broad topic of data engineering in general. And I would say like analytics engineering and DBT fits in as one small piece of that. But I think if you're looking more to understand like the data life cycle at a high level, it talks a lot about some of the things that you mentioned in the question. So that could be like a really high level place to start, but I think it depends on how much in the weeds you're trying to get to. I don't know, Emily, if you have maybe any more that are a bit more applicable.
Yeah, don't really have any others off the top of my head.
Awesome. I think someone else asked for like blogs and articles on best practices for scaling DBT.
I think the DBT docs have a lot of things like different guides around how to like think about setting up your DBT project and how to think about the different types of materializations and stuff like that. I don't know, Lindsay, do you know of any other good places for that?
It's hard to give one name because I feel like I follow a lot of people who do a lot of really good blog posts. So I don't know if there's one that's like really centralizes a lot of these things, but yeah, like the Seattle data guy comes to mind. He talks a lot about data engineering and a bit about DBT and things like that. Just trying to think of a few others. Chad Sanderson has some good things on his blog about lots of different data engineering topics. Yeah, I don't know.
Someone asked, any thoughts around Y42 and their ecosystem versus DBT Cloud?
No, don't know what that is.
Yeah, I haven't used that tool before.
I think that was the last question that we had. If anyone has any other questions, there's still a couple minutes left, so feel free to pop them in the Q&A box.
Lots of great questions.
Yeah, thank you very much for the engagement, everyone.